résistance.
Quels sont les ressorts de la résistance?
Le sens profond de la résistance. Pourquoi finalement, au nom de quelles valeurs je me mobilise?
Résister contre qui et pourquoi?
Résister contre toute forme de régime totalitaire ou très autoritaire.
À se battre pour nos droits et nos libertés, parce que dans beaucoup de pays, justement, tout ça c'est un peu mis à mal.
For promoting democracy, I was threatened to be in jail for 20 years.
I am activist against execution because I don't want anyone has this experience which I have.
Le rôle de la jeunesse est très important dans cette paix et je m'en vais vous dire que nous, jeunes, nous sommes prêts.
Cette lutte des Ukrainiens concerne nous tous parce qu'ils se battent pour la démocratie, ils se battent pour la paix, ils se battent pour la liberté.
Et c'est pour cela que ces jeunes puissent être inspirés de ce qui peut se faire de mieux en matière de gouvernance publique, de respect des droits, de respect des libertés, et que ces jeunes puissent devenir les vecteurs de la démocratie de demain. Vive la Normandie, vive la démocratie et vive la liberté.
Good evening and a warm welcome to the Maison française at New York University. La Maison française at New York University is one of the leading centers for French culture in the United States. The director is François Nudelman, and I happen to be the chief advisor for François Nudelman and for the Maison. We have decided to introduce a totally new program, which is starting tonight, devoted to geopolitics, which was not a topic until now covered by La Maison, but it's important, as you know. This program is sponsored by La Région Normandie, which means that beyond the audience that you have in front of you, thousands will be able to follow not only on Zoom, but also the program will be taped, subtitled in French, and shown all around for students, mostly in the Normandy region. This series, we took the title of Raymond Aron's book, Peace and War Between Nations, which is a very famous book, very influential in France. And this series will start tonight with the first session devoted to the concept of Global South. Ambassador Philippe Etienne, former ambassador to the United States, will moderate the debate, and the floor is now yours.
I will ask each of our panelists now to present, to introduce them, and then after this series of introduction, we will start our presentation as a substance. So Yusuke first.
Yes. Thank you everyone for being here today, and thank you, Guy, for the invitation. My name is Yusuke Shimizu. I work for the International Finance Corporation, part of the World Bank Group. I work in its partnership section. I'll repeat what Philip said, that I'll be speaking on a personal capacity. But I've also, in addition to the World Bank, previously I worked for the Japanese Diplomatic Service for about 15 years, with postings at the UN here in New York, as well as Mexico and Spain. And also I had a brief experience at the Google's government affairs section, where I was dealing with the Northeast Asian region vis-a-vis Google, namely China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Japan and Korea vis-a-vis its relationship with the company. It's a pleasure to be here.
Please, Professor. Yeah.
Hello. Pleasure to be here too. My name is Yao Nyako. I'm a professor of economics here at NYU. My office is down there somewhere. I'm also the director of NYU's Africa House, which is literally across the road. I feel very embarrassed. This is actually my first time here, so shame on me. Maybe there's this split between Anglophone Africa and Francophone Africa, so there's a line and we never cross or something. I don't know what it is. But I'm originally from Ghana. I'm doing a lot of research on development economics in a town called Kumo. We're doing a lot of, we're trying to transform the place. So in my interventions, I'll tell you a bit more about that and why I think even the villagers need to care about these definitions and these conversations here. So really glad to be here.
Thank you. Please.
Yeah, good evening. I'm Ken Weinstein. I am the Japan chair at Hudson Institute, where I served as CEO for about 15 years. And my work is, by and large, on geopolitics, and particularly the geopolitics of Asia. But I should say it's a real pleasure to be not only on this distinguished panel, but to be back with Ambassador Etienne, whom I've seen in his functions in Berlin, Paris, and in Washington, among other places. And sorry to miss Guy Sorman. And on a last note, about 40 years ago, when I was about the age of some of these students here, I really started to learn French, in part because I was in a program in Lisieux. So I have great affection for Normandie and for la région and for the students and the teachers there. So thank you.
Thank you, Kenneth.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Professor Adekeye Adebajo. I'm based at the University of Pretoria in South Africa, and I work on security and foreign policy in Africa.
Thank you.
My name is Happy Mon Jacob, and I teach at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. I also run a think tank focusing on security issues in Delhi. I've just finished writing a book on, in fact, the professor was asking me, what do you make of non-alignment, Indian non-alignment? I just finished a book which is tentatively entitled After Non-Alignment, interpreting India's foreign policy. But good to be here. Thank you for having me.
I begin with my definition, which I think I should start by outlining that there is no official definition of the Global South, neither in the World Bank nor with regards to the Japanese government. But the way I see it, I think it's more a concept than an actual group, which can be characterized as being very fluid and very diverse. What we find ourselves today is that that concept is trying to coalesce into an actual group that can leverage its political weight, economic strength, and potentially military influence in the shaping of the international order. And I think there's two factors that point to why we're talking about the term in the first place. I think one is the reality that these global South countries are a weight in the world economy. Some facts just to throw around. For example, Japan and its G7 partners, the advanced nations of the world, 40 years ago, they represented 50% of global GDP. Today, they represent less than a third. When you talk about global trade, 1/4 of all global trade is between countries like India, Brazil. That is, between South-South trade already comprises 1/4 of global trade. And if you talk about FDIs, foreign direct investment, 1/3 of all global FDIs emanate from Southern companies, be they from China, Brazil, Mexico, etc. So I think that's what we're dealing with. They have a real weight that they did not have. And I refer to the past because the concept itself is not new. We talk, even when I was at the UN, we had a group called the G77, which is an alignment of various countries that were not the US, not Russia, but they gathered to talk about, to see if they can coalesce around a single policy for various issues at the UN. That's existed long before I was there, and I was there about 10 years ago. There's been, the World Bank refers to the group as developing economies and emerging markets, and that's basically based purely on economic GDP per capita. That's whether a country can be eligible for foreign assistance. So that type of concept existed. And also, if you hark back to 1955, when a lot of these former colonies became independent, they met in Bandung, Indonesia. And that's, I think, when really those countries really came together to see themselves as a potential power. I think what's different today is that they no longer see themselves as being objects of assistance. They no longer see themselves as observer of the international order. I think they try to see themselves as a proactive voice in shaping world affairs, and they have the wherewithal to do it. I think that's part of the big reason. And the other big element is the international order we find ourselves in. I think there's what we're seeing is an erosion of the degree to which countries, entities respect, abide by, and promote international order. Some of the basic tenets, such as like territorial integrity. We've seen that being challenged, invaded, without too much consequences. I think there is a certain vacuum in which these countries, with their newfound power, find a place to shape that international order, which they did not have the opportunity to do when they became independent in the 50s or 60s, because the international order, as we know it, exemplified by institutions like the UN, the Bretton Woods institutions like the World Bank, where I represent, or the IMF, et cetera, had already existed when they became independent. Now they see their chance, or they see, I think, their right to have a voice in shaping this status, which, and frankly, we can describe as being in a state of flux. I also ask myself, is this concept real? I said at the outset that it's not, that it's more a concept rather than a guru. And I say that because it's still very much fragmented, even within the so-called global South. Take, for example, India hosted two summits of the Global South titled Voices of the Global South this year. China was not part of that, or they did not attend. Last month, Xi Jinping sponsored the Belt and Road Initiative Summit in Beijing. India was not there. So can we talk about this one grouping, which in my mind, I think it's still very much fragmented. And I think the term that they use, global, is also representative of what it wants to be. It's an aspiration. I think what they recognize that power lies in the collective weight of that grouping. If it's diverse, then it's as before. You'll have groupings in Africa, you'll have South Asia, you'll have Latin America. But to be really able to have the power to shape international relations, I think they recognize that they need to be global, unified, which at the moment, I think is still an aspiration than a reality. Nonetheless, giving something a name does give it substance. It is something that you can gather around, and we've already seen it. The example of that summit taking place is perhaps even a step forward. We saw the BRICS summit this year decide to expand its membership by almost double. It was 5, now it's going to be 11 as of January 2024. And even from the standpoint of advanced countries, when the Japanese government hosted the G7 summit in Hiroshima, one of the main pillars of that conference was engagement with the global South, using that exact terminology. So I think it is gaining currency. And with that, perhaps it might become what it aspires to be. If you look back, BRICS began with a concept by an investment banker at Goldman Sachs. It was basically a list of 4 countries that they thought was going to be big. But now they have 15 summits. They even have its own development bank, which could potentially be a rival to the World Bank. It is not today, but who knows in the future. So I think Is it real? It's not yet, but it does have the potential to be real. Lastly, I asked the question, is it relevant, important? I'd argue that that grouping, this group of 100 or so countries, all the way from India, China to Tuvalu and Pacific Islands, had always been important. And we saw that with, especially after the financial crisis of 1999, when we had the first G20 summit in Pittsburgh, US. And that was when they recognized that the advanced countries of the G7 weren't powerful enough to resolve all the global crises that we're facing. So at least in the economic sphere, the emerging countries were already in power to reckon with. Now they're expanding into the realm of geopolitics. And we saw that highlighted especially from the point of view of the countries that promote the liberal international order, like the US, Japan, etc. We saw the geostrategic importance of the global South play out in response to the Ukraine crisis. If you recall, after the invasion, the Security Council failed to adopt a resolution, so they took it to the General Assembly. They adopted a series of resolutions condemning Russia's invasion, but two resolutions failed to get passed. One was the attempt to remove Russia from the International Council of Human Rights, and second was a resolution on reparations. Those resolutions failed to get even a majority. I think they got 48% of the vote. I think that was, I can't speak for the government, but it was what it really hit them, that the support of the global South or these other countries is no longer a given. So I think the geostrategic importance is rising as well. And also, maybe I'll end with, there's no crystal ball, but whether this concept is something helpful or whether it leads to conflict. That's a very difficult question to answer, but if by having a third pillar, or in second or third, depending on how you look at it, the US, Western Europe, China, et cetera, than the global South, if that leads to greater fragmentation, I think that's a cause for conflict. And when you talk about fragmentation, we are already seeing that it emanate in various fields. Economically, we're also already talking about decoupling, de-risking. Granted, I recognize the rationale for it, especially with regards to economic security. But by and large, a movement retrenchment away from the free movement of goods, people, and ideas in the aggregate is probably not a healthy sign. Sorry, and I'll end my expression here.
No, you can say 2 words still, but I have to signal that you. Thank you very much. You gave the right start with the right format. Dear colleague, Professor Nyarko, please.
Okay, so I will continue right along, and I'm very glad to be here to talk about this. I am an economist. I tend to be more on the theoretical side, but the thought of war and peace and the possibility that we may be entering World War III sort of like woke me up and just said I need to get away from my slumber in theoretical economics and start speaking up. My guess is part of the reason why we're having this conversation on the global South is Ukraine. Let's just face it. There are many people who are just a little bit upset that, Western Europe, America is fighting against Russia. We're looking for our friends in Africa, in India, and they're not stepping up. It's like, wait a minute, you're supposed to be our friends. You're supposed to be our buddies. Why aren't you criticizing Russia? Why aren't you with us? And so the concept of the global South but has been voiced as in a little bit of disappointment by the global North. Why aren't you guys supporting us, okay? So let me give you a few remarks on that. And as I said before, I'm actually doing some research work in Ghana right now. I spent a lot of time there during the research work. So I just like to give you guys a picture Imagine you're talking to a very smart villager, and there's some really smart people there, people who have read lots of history, and they're in their West African cloths, and they'll just impress you with their knowledge of history, their knowledge of politics, and their wit. What would they say if I asked them, what is the global South? So I think many of them will begin by saying, but wait a minute. At independence, we had this thing called the Organization of African Unity, OAU. All of the independence movements, that's where they all were. So for many Africans my age and older, it's all about the OAU. Kwame Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, Haile Selassie, they're our heroes. That's the thing we were trying to create. And so we've been struggling for a long time to create this thing called the OAU. It didn't go that far. And then all of a sudden, surprise, surprise, they took the O out of OAU and became the African Union. And it moved away from Ghana and Ethiopia, and all of a sudden it's in South Africa. How the heck did that happen? Anyway, let's keep going on. So you're telling me something about the global South. Where did that come from? Well, research shows Carl Oglesby in 1969 came up first with the idea of a global South, okay? Along the way, remember they used to call us the third world?
Yeah.
And so I think they looked at GDP figures, and so the first world was the Western world, second world was Russia, because they were a little bit poorer, and the rest of us, unfortunates, we get lumped into this thing called the third world, okay? People protested about that, and so somebody from the global north, Willy Brandt, decided to come up with a different name. And so this is the Chancellor Brandt. Yeah. And so they drew that line, right? They tried to use GDP to say if your GDP is above this, you're here. But the line was all the poor guys were in the south, all the rich guys were in the north. You go to Mexico, you go through the Mediterranean, you get India into there. And of course, you do a little bit of, hand waving so that you can exclude Australia, New Zealand, and all those places, okay? So that's the definition of the global South, okay? We like it. Okay, we'll deal with it. Why is that group the group that we should all have ourselves coalesced in? The people in Kumu, the people in Africa, many of them will say, OAU, AU, I understand. But this global South thing, I just don't quite get it. And if Europe is telling us that we in the global South needs to support the war, things are different for us. This guy Putin, he had his right-hand man, Prigozhin, and you all know what happened to him, right? And so if we try and start saying mean, bad things about Russia, what's going to happen to us? All right? So as a global South, should we be doing that? You want us to go and talk to China. China was, it's been friendly to Russia. But the Chinese are building our roads. They've stepped in as Europe and America has stepped out, right? And so why should we go out there and start saying mean things to China, okay? Even Israel. So I know that Israel, Gaza, there's a different issue, but let's roll the clock before that, okay? You all remember that even Israel wasn't criticizing Ukraine, despite the fact that the leader of Ukraine is of Jewish background. Golda Meir, I think, was from Ukraine. But even Israel, mighty Israel with U.S. backing, didn't criticize Russia. So why should we? Okay? So again, talking about war and peace, those are some of the issues that we need to deal with. Why should all these countries be lumped together? So Brazil is supposed to be part of the global South, right? So I remember when Lula was around, everything was great. Lula made an outreach to Africa. But when Lula left the first time, and Trump, no, not Trump, the Trump impersonator came into power, then all of a sudden, Brazil wanted to be like the United States and had nothing to do with Africa, okay? So why should all of us be lumped together? A little bit of statistics. You mentioned some statistics, so here are some others. If you look within the group of the global South, the average versus the highest in the global South is multiplied by 11. If you look at the lowest versus the highest in terms of GDP per capita, it's multiplied by 25. You have a vast range of countries in the global south. Why should we all be lumped together? Just by this chance that we all happen to be in the southern part of the hemisphere? It doesn't, there's something about it which it's begging for a reason, okay? If you go to Kumu, what will you find there? You'll find that most people are worried about something completely different. Yes, Ukraine is on the news everywhere in the Western world, but if you go there, they're looking at Ukraine, trying to figure out what happens. They're saying, I hope these Europeans don't start another war. They started 2 before, and we got messed up really bad, okay? And so the Third World War could come about, right? Okay? Because of that conflict. So why should we be suffering about it? And some of these people back in Kumu would say, I wish these guys in the North would get their act together and find some kind of compromise, okay? Those of us, I live in the United States, and so my perception is a little bit different, right? Russia's the bad person. They came to invade. If we don't stop them at the Ukraine border, they're going to wipe out all of the rest of Europe. But in Africa, we're just saying to ourselves, you've caused 2 world wars in the past. In those 2 world wars, our people were sent, because we were French colonies and English colonies, we were sent all the way out there to the battlefield to help fight the European war. This time around, with World War III, by the time you pick up the phone to call us to try and help, the world may have been wiped out already, okay? With these smart weapons and all of that. So the people in Ghana will be just saying, you know, we're watching this, but is it really our issue? Is it really our problem? Back in Ghana, everybody, it's all about economic transformation. If you ask me what people are thinking about, it's all about changing the economic plight of our nations. We are extremely poor. For whatever reason, you can blame it on slavery, Ghana's president has. You can blame it on the colonial experience, okay? We were given a very, very bad set of cards upon independence. We had next to no universities, no medical school, no architecture school, nothing at independence. So you could blame that. Regardless, or you could say we were corrupt, we were bad, we didn't know how to rule ourselves, whatever the reason. Today, ours is about economic transformation. So if...
Professor, you're close to the 10 minutes.
Close to the 10 minutes? Okay. So if indeed the global south is something which can enhance our economic advancement, we're all for it. Hooray, we'll do it. But if the global south is just for us to talk about problems in the global north, no way, we don't accept it. Thank you very much.
Which leads to a very, very clear conclusion.
Exactly.
Great. Well, thank you. These have been excellent presentations, and I think we come at this from very different standpoints, though I have spent some time in Ghana and in West Africa, but my viewpoint's not taken from there. I'm among those who are skeptical of the concept of the global south. I think it's too vague. It's become politically charged. It's somewhat contradictory. And so in the first part of my talk, I'm going to say why we shouldn't take the concept utterly seriously as a framework. It's something, as Suki indicated, needs to be refined, I think. In the second part, I will say however, that because China has attempted to exploit this ill-conceived concept, and I'd say somewhat hypocritically, which I will explore, it leads to my conclusion, which is that those in the West, and that's the perspective I have, conceptual challenges notwithstanding, we need to have a responsible concept that is continuing to gain hold. And so the rickety foundation of the global south, I think we've heard it from both of these gentlemen, the relative wealth disparities, as we heard from Professor Nyarko, places like Malaysia, other places like Somalia, Solomon Islands. There are massive economic problems. Some of the global south countries have, some of them have problems that extend well beyond economics. You obviously have well-governed nations, Costa Rica, Mauritius, Namibia, with a decent level of prosperity and basket cases, which we all know of, South Sudan in particular. And then there are those like South Africa, which I don't dare to speak for, but that are prosperous but by African standards, but increasingly hostile to the West and more aligned with Russia and China. So, and you just look at the global south itself, there are 35 different armed conflicts going on right now inside of Africa that, and for these countries, this far outweighs the challenges they see with the global north. And you just look at some of them, obviously, Iran and Saudi Arabia, the challenges the two of them face, which are playing out on a broader stage. China and India, both of which vie for leadership of the global south, even though they're both in the northern hemisphere and both are becoming technology hubs. They have a large border dispute. Talked about the BRICS movement growing. You know, the new members are Brazil is the only one in the actual south, Saudi Arabia and Argentina, which now has Mr. Milley, the neoliberal leader, in power, very pro-American. I sort of see the global south as kind of a projection of a neo-colonial academic jargon arising largely here in the U.S., a focus on the other in discourse, and something that's been somewhat sloppily projected onto the international stage, but something that there's an essence to it that really is sort of clear, which is the notion of being dispossessed on the world stage and dispossessed in terms of international debates, dispossessed in terms of economic well-being as well. But the fact that it has been argued, I think, somewhat sloppily has opened the door for a dictatorship like China to exploit it. And China likes to pretend that it's part of the global south, that it speaks for the downtrodden on issues like climate change, indebtedness, economic inequality, in an attempt to sow doubts about the post-war world order. And it particularly sees Africa, which is the largest collection of developing countries in the world, as crucial to its project of reordering the international system. It's extended an inordinate amount of diplomatic energy in Africa. And for 3 decades now, the foreign minister of China's first overseas visit, with 2 exceptions, has been to Africa. And some of this involves outreach to African elites, including via pecuniary means that we in the West have outlawed. Some of it are these big infrastructure projects, which I'll turn to in a second. And when you travel throughout Africa, you'll be somewhere, you'll see some large, beautiful building, and you'll ask, what is that? And they'll say, that's the defense ministry. Oh, who built it? The Chinese. And, you know, and then you'll hear, oh, that's the communications ministry. Who built it? The Chinese. But then you start talking to the African elites, and they know that they've gone through these buildings, down every single wall, every wire is bugged, every internet, et cetera, that China is doing this for a reason. So African states are generally skeptical of the West because they do feel dispossessed, and they tend to vote for China in the UN in China's efforts to challenge the Western-led order. And we see it, you know, with surprisingly high rates, particularly they tend to be 40 to 50% of the signatories to letters praising Chinese policies with regard to the other, to the minority populations, whether they be in Xinjiang, whether they be in Tibet or elsewhere, who have been imprisoned, have been put in concentration camps, have been cut off from their native lands by the Chinese. They also oftentimes support Chinese candidates to head UN specialized agencies. Now, African states in general don't have a clear sense of what they want in terms of a new global system. They obviously want permanent African representation at the Security Council, less dependency on the dollar as a global currency. But what they want is usually, they're expressing more frustration with the global system, with its inequalities, more than advocating, right as of now, for a coherent replacement. But much as China pretends to be the great friend of the global South, its share of GDP is 18%. It's just slightly below that of the rest of the developing world at 24%. And China, moreover, tends to act like a member of the global North. It is the largest carbon emitter in the world. It is the single largest economic development creditor in the world. It is often the lender of last resort, with predatory, non-transparent loan practices, including bribery, and even practices a form of neo-imperialism with regard to fishing rights and mineral rights, confiscating properties when loans are not met. And in addition, when China is not dealing with the global South, it presents itself as a pure competitor of the United States. Lastly, I'd say it has probably done more in recent years to promote repression in the global South through its high-tech surveillance systems implanted through Huawei and its internet surveillance system than
maybe any other nation, though you could argue the Wagner Group with what it's doing in West Africa is also posing a significant challenge. So allow me to conclude on this point. I think the Global South argument itself may be less than coherent, but the fact that China takes it seriously, gives it credibility in speaking for the dispossessed means that we need to do a much better job in the West in competing. This is complex. It's not easy to do. China, particularly on the loan side, has been able to act rapidly to massive infrastructure needs, certainly, but they've done it in a way where they have overreached to certain nations. They have promoted failing governments. They have left nations in serious debt traps through Belt and Road. That being said, I think we need to do a much better job of developing relations of trust with the global South. The United States and under the Biden administration is doing a much better job of engaging with developing nations, with the Philippines, Vietnam in particular. The Japanese have done an extraordinary job, particularly in Southeast Asia, of consistent economic engagement as a means to develop trust and partnership. We need to go much further in Africa to work to support groups that promote freedom, liberalization, freer trade. We need to promote greater trade liberalization for the developing world. Access to our markets is very important. And lastly, I'd say as we look, and the European Union is obviously taking efforts as well in terms of connectivity with its Gateway Initiative, which and the Biden administration is doing more of this to try to meet infrastructure needs. But I think as we look at the way the world is heading, I think that we're likely to see three blocks emerge. I think we're likely to see a Western-led bloc, which the United States will remain the leader of, for better or for worse. Some in Europe may not like it, but there's no alternative. China is clearly trying to be some kind of a bloc, and I think we're more likely to see India rise. And I think the United States, much as the United States spent a lot of time in the 70s and 80s trying to encourage the growth of China and economic prowess of China, we ought to spend our time now encouraging India to develop economically. It is not a perfect country, but it is certainly a pluralistic, democratic country, and one that I think could have more of a natural appeal to the global South with its pluralistic, democratic ways, with its more open approach to society than China. So
thank you very much.
Thoughts.
You exactly landed at the 10th minute. Professor, please.
Thank you very much. The title of our presentation, or of our topic here, is the concept of the global South and its origins. So I want to take a historical approach and actually look at the origins of the global South and then see whether it actually poses a conflict risk, which is the second part of it. So when two elephants fight, the global South and non-alignment is what I want to focus on. An African proverb notes that when two elephants fight, it's the grass underneath its feet that suffers. And the whole idea of global South is a call for a renewal of the Cold War concept for non-alignment so that the global South states do not have to become embroiled in conflicts that are going to harm their own interests. You don't have to pick sides in a new Cold War between a China-led bloc and a US-led bloc. That's basically the basic idea. I thought after briefly assessing the history of non-alignment and explaining the global South, we want to look at a few regional examples very quickly: Latin America, Southeast Asia, and Africa, and how they are conceptualizing non-alignment, and then a few closing remarks on Gaza, which is happening all around us. During the March 2022 UN General Assembly summit, as we heard, or during the voting rather, when the West pushed to sanction Russia, 52 countries from the global South did not vote with the West to sanction Russia. Many of those states contained much of the population of the world. And this came as a bit of a shock to a lot of our Western partners. The global South was expressing its rage at the double standards that it's seen over the Doha trade round, for example, over things like the US invasions of Grenada, of Panama, of Iraq. And I think that's something that's very important to keep in mind. And then the promises that have been broken on the $100 billion a year on cleaning up the climate, which has been messed up by the rich North. Non-alignment was an ideology of the poor, a weapon of the weak, if you want, that was employed by newly independent third world states from the 1950s, basically to avoid getting embroiled in the Cold War between the East and the West. The Bandung Conference of 1955 was absolutely seminal to the birth of the Global South, because this was where Asia and Africa basically came together to assert and regain their sovereignty from their European colonial powers, to escape 5 centuries of slavery and colonial exploitation, basically. The now 120-strong non-aligned movement was established in 1961 and required members to basically avoid signing security alliances with NATO, with the Warsaw Pact, and to host military bases on their territories. That was really the idea. And it wasn't, as is often been caricatured, passive neutrality, but rather positive neutrality. The idea was that the Global South would try to reform and strengthen institutions of global governance like the UN, which of course was protecting and guaranteeing their sovereignty that Europeans had basically violated for centuries. India's Jawaharlal Nehru was the intellectual father of non-alignment, and he pushed for nuclear disarmament on the basis that these 2 superpowers should not be able to blow up the world without the rest of humanity having a say in it. You also had Indonesia's Suharto, who was pushing regional resilience and regional autonomy, i.e. keeping outside meddlers away from Southeast Asia. You had Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was accepting aid and arms from both East and West. And you had Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah, who was calling for an African high command as a kind of pan-continental army to keep external meddlers out of Africa. This is what the NAM was really about. But of course, it was hard to maintain cohesion among such a large group. And there were countries like Cuba, the Francophone African countries, which had French military bases, and others, which were clearly aligned to one side of the Cold War demand. And what's important is that by the 1980s, the non-aligned movement was already moving away from geopolitics and moving towards geoeconomics as the kind of euphoria of the new international economic order of the 70s failed to materialize, and the technology transfer and industrialization did not happen. Let me move quickly to the 3 regions before I conclude. Starting with Latin America, many countries in this region have basically ignored US demands not to do business with China and have happily traded with China. Latin American scholars have come up with the idea of active non-alignment, which basically urges the regional states to build effective regional mechanisms to be able to promote global geoeconomics and also regional foreign policies. Southeast Asian countries, on the other hand, have often kind of promoted declaratory non-alignment, but in practice, they've practiced a more promiscuous multi-alignment. So they've signed military alliances with countries like Britain, the US, New Zealand, Australia, but also kept close enough contact with China. And the idea is to hedge their bets and prevent any powers from basically having entangling alliances that could destabilize their region. Unlike ASEAN, Africa has no regional power like China that can dominate its continent. It doesn't have a global power like the US that can also create alliances in that way and become a regional power. And so issues and situations like the proposed US congressional legislation to kind of punish African countries that do business with Russia and China are actually having the opposite effect. It's making African countries want to revive the concept of non-alignment. So you have South Africa rather clumsily sometimes reasserting a strategic non-alignment. So over Ukraine, for example, South Africa has refused to condemn its BRICS partner, Russia. It's called for mediation within the United Nations and basically blamed the Western expansion, NATO's expansion close to Russia for what has happened there. South Africa has also spoken very clearly in terms of the Gaza situation, recalling its embassy, and just today, its parliament basically called for the closing of the Israeli embassy. And it's important that African countries actually practice genuine non-alignment. They have to dismantle the basis of the US, of France, of China in Africa, get rid of Russia's Wagner mercenaries, and speak clearly. There's no contradiction between condemning the US in Iraq, condemning Russia in Ukraine, condemning Israel in Gaza. That's really how to practice non-alignment. Let me close, Chair, by coming back to current events. Current events in Gaza actually feel very much like Groundhog Day. They clearly symbolize the need for a strong dam that can provide, its voice, make its voice heard over global injustices. So even though Hamas launched a horrific attack that killed 1,400 Israelis, it's clearly disproportionate to have killed 12,000 Palestinian civilians and displaced 1.5 million. The unconditional support that most Western governments have given to Israel will make it harder to mobilize international diplomatic support over Ukraine. And we have an international system which is Orwellian, in which some countries appear to be more equal than others. And these double standards actually are catching up. So you had the UN General Assembly vote recently in which 120 countries called for, an end to Palestinian collective suffering and an end to the Israeli siege, and only 14 voted against. So Israel and the US were actually grossly isolated, contrary to what your Western media like CNN and others tends to present very one-sidedly. And I think it's important to note...
Professor, we
this
come
is
to
my
that
last sentence.
Perfect. Then.
Israel needs to learn lessons because Washington has seen this Gaza movie before in Afghanistan and Iraq. We all know how it ends. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Philip. In my 10 minutes, I will try and speak about 4 issues. And from a very Indian perspective, let me put it that way. First of all, I will try and look at some of the characteristics of what I call the new global South. Then I'll talk about the China factor in global South, which could potentially be a point of conflict. And 3, the difference between the Indian and Chinese views on the new global South, as it were. And finally, why the US and the West must engage the new global South. I think I call it the new global South for a variety of reasons. I think the new global South is very different from its Cold War avatar. To begin with, I think today's global South it has taken a post-ideological turn. It is not an ideological global South of the kind that we had witnessed during the Cold War years. Most of the global South is no longer ideologically motivated, and despite the occasional revisionist rhetoric, I think most countries are adept at pursuing their own national interest. Secondly, I think the new global South has a new agenda altogether. Gone are the days when in the NAM or in G77 or in the global South, the rallying cries were resistance to capitalism and globalization, or colonial and racist practices in global governance, etc., etc. Those are now passé. People are talking about very different things these days. Even the non-aligned movement, for that matter, is no longer a force in world politics, as it were. These issues have been replaced by a very pragmatic agenda. So in that sense, pragmatic politics is at the heart of the new global South, if I may put it that way. Pursuit of interests, self-interest or common interest for that matter, is the new ideology of the new global South. So the new global South for a lot of countries is a means to an end, not an end in itself. I think, to my mind, that is very important. Let me sort of go to my second part, and that is about the China question. To my mind, the question whether the global South is going to be a source of conflict is to some extent answered by the China question, right? I mean, China is really the wild card here, and I think the China factor could potentially induce a conflict from the global South. You know, despite the many disqualifications that China has in terms of being part of the global South, traditionally it has not been part of the global South. The global South is viewed by Beijing with a very clear instrumental utility, as it were. So Beijing realizes, for example, the loyalty or the geopolitical goodwill, if you will, of some 130 odd countries who turned up at the BRI forum, I think last month, from around the world, could effectively undergird Beijing's geopolitical ambitions or global ambitions, as it were. In fact, China has built an empire of influence in the global South, in Asia and Africa. And there is, of course, the leadership competition for the global South between India and China. And I believe that if China wins this competition, and there is every chance that China could potentially win this competition for the leadership of the global South, it may, I think, become a source of conflict between the North and the South, as it were. Let me highlight four differences between the Indian and Chinese views of the global South. To begin with, I think India views itself as a bridge between the global South and the developed world, or the global North, as it were. China fancies itself at the top of an alternative world order, different from that of the Euro-Atlantic order. Even if China is institutionally part of that Euro-Atlantic order. I mean, you know, look at the UNSC. It's a family picture of the victors of the Second World War plus China. So China has no reason to complain about it. For example, China's Global Civilizational Initiative, launched in March 2023, for example, is an alternative forum different from the so-called also called the Western values, as it were. You know, we don't believe in universal values. We have to sort of go back to national values, etc. Put differently, while China views itself or offers itself as itself to the global South as the alternative, New Delhi's objective is to sort of advocate for a reformed global order, as it were, not show itself as the alternative. I think the second big difference between the Chinese view of the global South and the Indian view of the global South is that Beijing's view of the South-South cooperation revolves around its own mega project, the BRI, Belt and Road Initiative. China's annual, somebody mentioned this, China's annual Belt and Road Forum in Beijing is no longer attracting Western audience or American audience, but it is becoming a networking space for the global South. There's 130 representatives stand up in Beijing, I think last month. The forum hosted 130 countries, and global South was one of the major talking points in that forum. So I think going forward, given the cold shouldering of the BRI by the United States and Western countries, we may be looking at China trying to oversell the BRI in the global South. So for China, South-South cooperation, therefore, is primarily a BRI-led growth for the global South countries. On the other hand, for India, cooperation with actors outside is very much part of the global South-South cooperation. For example, in India, we call it the trilateral cooperation. You cooperate with other global South countries, along with, say, the United States or Germany or Japan, for that matter, in various parts of the global South. The third, I think, difference between the Chinese imagination of the global South and the Indian imagination of the Global South is their respective conceptualizations of the Global South itself. For India, Global South is a historical product of colonialism, racism, North-South disparities, and undemocratic global institutions. As a result, New Delhi's aim is to find solutions to those issues by constructively engaging the global North or the developed world. For the Indian imagination, ideological revisionism is no longer a useful strategy to address North-South challenges. Instead, it seeks a reformed status quo. China, on the other hand, has a somewhat historical view of the Global South. Clearly, China does not share the unique colonial experiences that much of the Global South has. It was never part of the non-aligned movement, for that matter. China's own historical connections to the Global South is an older one in terms of trade, commerce, and occasional subjugation of some countries in the Global South itself, including in Africa and probably including Sri Lanka, countries like Sri Lanka, I suppose, going way back. And plus, it's a $16.8 trillion economy. And it's the world's second largest and a middle-income economy. As many people pointed out, does it really make sense for China to be part of the Global South argumentation in terms of the haves and have-nots in the international system? Finally, I think, I have about 2 minutes more. The fourth difference, I think, is their respective strategies in engaging the Global South. While China seeks to utilize the existing forums such as the G20, the non-aligned movement, the United Nations climate change conferences, G77 and UNGA to assert positions of the Global South, China seeks to create alternative China-led forums such as the BRI Forum, Global Development Initiative, Global Security Initiative, and Global Civilization Initiative, etc., etc. Beijing also uses carefully designed anti-US Western frames such as the rejection of hegemony, rules-based international order, etc., etc. So these rhetorical tools that China uses are far more appealing to the Global South countries than the sort of moderate position that India tends to take. I have a minute. I'll end by, I have a lot more to speak, but I'll talk about that later. I'll end by saying that, yes, there is a problem of definitional clarity. But if something exists as a reality, I think you got to engage with that, whether or not there is definitional clarity. I mean, that's just common sense if you ask me. My second concluding point is that don't look for a clear definition as to what defines the Global South. Look for the message. What is the Global South trying to say? What is the uneasiness? What is the complaint? What is the unhappiness there? So deal with that. Don't look for clarity and definitions, as it were. The concept of Global South is as vague, if you ask me, as the global order itself, as the concept of the global order. Tell me what is the global order? What is the international order? How do you define that? So it's as vague as that. And finally, Kenneth, in response to your point about China using this definitional lack of a good definition, I don't think it is the lack of a definition that China is making use of. What China is making use of is the unaddressed unhappiness or complaints of the Global South. Once you deal with that, I think the Chinese ability to use the Global South for their own instrumental purposes will be a thing of the past. I'll end with that. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. We have heard voices and powerful voices from Asia, Africa, America. It's maybe fair to have one European consideration. So I will say that Europe as such is a continent with nations which have indeed an history which has been characterized already slavery, colonialism on the one hand, but on the other hand, Europe is also a continent which has tried and which has succeeded to overcome as a continent, I mean Western Europe and then Central Europe joined, to overcome this history. It is the whole purpose of the European integration, of the European Union. And this European Union, as one of its first policies, has created a framework with African, Caribbean, and Pacific nations, which is the conventions of Yaoundé and then Lomé, which wanted at least to be a new model of cooperation between equals, which was not that, of course, because we had a lot of issues, especially in trade, for instance, but at least the Europeans have tried. They have been on this line, and I must say that it is normal that even 60 years after the independences in Africa, we still have to bear this, the weight of history. It does exist. We have to recognize this. But on the other hand, there is this, this attitude of the Europeans towards their own history and the willingness to engage from the very beginning of the European Union. Now, in this respect, I personally consider that, and it has been said that the global south, of course, does not exist, because in terms of a consistency of the positions, of level of development, of even political position, military confrontations, but the fact that we speak about the global south as such is a reality. And I think one of you have used the word dispossessed, and we must consider that it is this reality which is a reason also to ask ourselves what we can do. So I like the comparison with the non-aligned movements, which some of you have met, because I was also about to say that it looks like the non-aligned movements, in terms of not wanting to take sides, to be embroiled, you said, in different, with different camps opposing, with maybe China instead of the USSR now. But I think that there is a difference now, which is that what strikes me is that in this global south, the countries want not only to be non-aligned and not to be forced to be in one camp, but also they want to have their own decisions to decide to be on some issues with one superpower, for instance, on other issues with another. They want to be active. And I will mention an anecdote. I was traveling with our president to Africa. I will not say in which African country, it is not anyway necessary. But the question was asked by a French journalist to the African president who hosted us at the end about why will you buy European I don't know what railways or Chinese railways? And his answer was, why do you want me to choose when you have apples and oranges? I want to have both. And it's something we must respect because it's a game. What we cannot accept is, of course, and it is one of the questions, is this conceptions leads to possible confrontation. The concept of global south for me must be a concept which leads to more cooperation, not to more confrontation. And we see that it is, for the time being, difficult to use this concept for opening new venues of cooperation. But frankly, it is not the global north. By the way, if there were a global south, there would be something like a global north, which also does not exist, of course. But we in Europe, for instance, we are not the ones who refuse to reform the United Nations, the governance. We have put forward solutions, and we are not the ones who blocked it. We are not the ones who prevent to work on excessive indebtedness by the poorest countries. We have made efforts. I speak for my country in particular. So it's too easy to present, this global landscape today as something where some countries are selfishly want to keep their privileges. Of course, we have to reform the global governance. Of course, we have to handle together the issues. It is, frankly, what the European countries want to do. Again, it doesn't mean that we are absolutely perfect. On the contrary, we have still to, as I said, to see our history still there, and we have many things to do better. But when we speak about double standards, I feel that, of course, double standards do exist, but they exist on all sides. Frankly, they exist on all sides. And there were really massacres of populations which were not addressed, even in the global south, where everybody kept silent. And so we have to, I think the accusation of double standards, I understand where it comes from. By the way, when you speak about the invasion of Iraq in 2003, you know where my country was, at least. We must apply the same standards to all crises, to the international order. But let's be frank, we all have our double standards. Finally, and I would like to make you maybe react to what I would say, because I don't know whether it is possible or not, and I would like to hear from you whether and how you would advise our political leaders to proceed. Finally, the most important thing for me is to use this concept of global south and west or whatever to bring more cooperation on the issues which we face in common. We will have COP28 in a couple of days. How will it work to address together the issue of climate, the issue of biodiversity? We have the issue, as I said, of indebtedness. We have to reconcile the fight against poverty and the fight for climate and biodiversity. How can we manage this together? And finally, the third challenge for me, I already mentioned it, is how can we reform the international governance to make it more fair? We recognize that it is unfair. We recognize that what has been created after World War II does not represent anymore what should be the situation, where many countries should have more voice to the common decision. But how can we do that? Except to say how they see a positive dynamic now. How could we engage all together? Maybe using this global south. So you said, for instance, that maybe I heard the word coalesce of this notion. Do you see ways or organizations through which we could positively use this global south concept of global south? What should we do, those who are not in the global south? And what would be for you the priorities ahead to try to look at that? And then we will open the Q&A questions. I try to limit myself in 10 minutes, so I noticed that I didn't speak more than 10 minutes. And I would like you to react on the way ahead and how we could positively, we could envisage more cooperation between the Global South and the other countries.
Can I just speak on the development assistance part, because I work at the World Bank. In the most recent annual meetings that our president attended in Marrakesh, he referred to the Global South. He used that terminology, even though the World Bank is, like I said, doesn't use that criteria. And he saw this as part of the responsibility to respond to the cries that Happy Mom mentioned, that it's not the definition, but the message that they're emitting. In practical terms, I think one of the reality is that these Bretton Woods institutions by themselves cannot accommodate all the development assistance needs of those developing countries. For example, it's foreign remittances and private sector investment is a lot more in terms of development capital flows to developing countries than the World Bank or bilateral ODAs. So I think what's critical in trying to address the needs and the cries of development South is partnerships. It's not just the Bretton Woods institutions. It's perhaps partnering with other development institutions or the private sector, et cetera. That's just a very quick response.
You mean development banks from
yes.
All regions, maybe the new one from the BRICS?
I think there is already some sort of dialogue. How that plays out in practice is still an open question, I believe.
Well, thank you. It's very concrete. Other proposals or advice to the world leaders?
Yeah, mine is not so much a proposal as sort of, I just want to remind everybody, the audience, that different people have different goals. And so, we have to be careful that the goals of the West don't become the goals of the world. So, as I said in my intervention, the goals of many Africans is just to, get on that economic frontier. Our populations, where I work, there are people still in mud houses. There are people without water. There are people without electricity. That comes first. Okay.
You mean compared with climate, for instance?
Well, so for us, back in Africa, yes, many people, if you talk to them today about climate, when in their villages, they're in their mud huts, no water, no electricity, it just seems very, very distant. Mm-hmm. Okay? So yes, I mean, I'm a smart guy. I know that climate is good. We could destroy the planet. But again, for the people who are on the ground, that's a big thing. And let me say another thing which was not mentioned here. We in Africa are having a population explosion of younger people, okay? And that could be good and that could be bad. And one of the strange things that we haven't mentioned today, maybe because Ukraine is happening, migration. And so a lot of Africans are seeking jobs in the West. You see many of them boat people. Many of them I have relatives who have gone on that trek. And so that whole debate about people moving from the South to the North, we just want some compassion. And if I may be allowed just one more second, I love to say this. The first human being, Homo sapiens sapien, was from Africa. All of you who don't live in Africa, your ancestors did exactly what the Boer people are trying to do today. Thank you.
Yeah, a few points. Number one, I think it's important that we attempt to create parallel institutions as well in the West for international development that will allow the countries like Japan, the United States, Canada, Australia, others to much more seriously engage on these connectivity issues, work with the EU to make the kinds of investments that are needed. Secondly, I totally agree with Professor Nyarko. We cannot force the energy transition on countries where the needs are so massive and the ability to get to where they need to get to now can't be done quickly. So we absolutely need to let them use natural gas as a transition fuel. We need to bring next generation nuclear to the extent we can to Africa and to work on other kinds of energy sources as well in West Africa where they're really badly needed. One of the most interesting terms I ever heard was the term "Je suis low-bat," which I heard in Côte d'Ivoire about 15 years ago. What did that mean? That meant I'm exhausted. Why? Because low-bat, my battery is low. And it's a place, there was an old lady in a market where she couldn't charge her battery, but she was also exhausted from being out all day. Lastly, I appreciate your point on the hypocrisy. You look at the civil war in Syria, 500,000 dead, Yemen, 370,000. The lists are long. Israel has every right to defend itself against a barbaric attack that is on its frontier. That is very different than Afghanistan and Iraq. And Iraq, I will grant, was a mistake.
Thank you.
Thanks. I think before we jump to solutions, we need to at least understand the issues. And I want to respond directly to my predecessor. I think what you've painted about China's role in Africa is a complete caricature. I don't think it's based on facts. I think we're not naive as Africans about China. But China, the last time I checked, is America's largest creditor, is the second largest trading partner of America, and China's trade with Germany is more than the whole trade with Africa. And Angela Merkel put it very well when she said, why should we worry about Africa trading with China when we are trading profitably with them. So I want to just present a few counterfacts because I think you're misleading the audience with what you've presented here. I really do.
I didn't accuse you of misleading the audience.
Let me just finish,
is a strong
please.
term.
Let me finish, please.
I like that.
25% only of Chinese debts of the most indebted country, 7 out of 22 countries are Chinese. That is the fact. So the idea that China is putting African countries in debt is completely wrong. Most of those debts are owed to Western governments.
Come on, colleague. It becomes an issue. It becomes an issue. We have to have China on board. Here, I disagree with you. Of course, we start from a level where China is very low for indebtedness, but it is increasing very quickly. And China must be part of the international game to treat this problem and not to keep its own national game.
I don't disagree with that, and I'm not naive about China at all. China is after its own interest, and you'll notice I called for the dismantling of the Chinese base in Djibouti.
You said it.
Okay?
Absolutely.
So I'm not pro-China, but I'm pro the truth. And China is the largest trading partner in Africa at $254 billion. It's lent $160 billion to Africa over the last 2 decades. 2/3 of that has gone into infrastructure investment. 20% of Africa's industrial output, China is responsible for. Much of its infrastructure, 70% of its 4G. Okay. So to have the second largest economy in the world investing in the poorest continent in the world makes complete sense. But let me make one final sentence.
We will not transform the panel into a debate between 2 or 3 of us on China. I knew it would come, but
it's true. But let me make one last sentence. You've portrayed China as exporting autocracy to Africa. The US supported Mobutu Sese Seko, Siad Barre, Samuel Doe during the Cold War. More recently, it's supporting dictators in Egypt, in Chad, all over the Gulf states. And the US has a presence in 20 African countries. I'm sure you're aware of that. So for you to be talking about China as this threat, I think is irresponsible and not even-handed.
Maybe first our Indian colleague.
Well, I mean, I have a very quick comment to make, and that is in response to what you asked in terms of policy suggestions. You know, I'd basically, as I said earlier, would not worry too much about definitions and definitional clarity. What I would say is that look at the message. And if I may sort of very quickly say, there are several issues that need to be addressed. For example, the question of climate change fund. You know, we talk about energy transition in this part of the world. In our part of the world, the first energy transition is getting energy. Right, any kind of energy. And that's the most important energy transition as far as we are concerned. So we keep talking about climate change fund. Where is the climate change fund? We keep talking about vaccines, COVID vaccines. The COVID vaccine patent waiver has not yet been done. So in many parts of the world, we are probably still worried about what happens to the COVID vaccine patents and the waiver thereafter. And it's also, when we talk about, you know, the international organization, we are not just talking about the UNS, we are also talking about the World Bank, the IMF, and several of those things. So I think it is important to recognize that there is a world outside of Europe and the United States, and sometimes a little conflict, sometimes a little pushback, sometimes a little rhetoric is useful in reminding people that, hey, we exist. And I think it's important that we have this genuine conversation about the concerns that the Global South faces, even though there is no definition.
Well,
thank you.
Thank you very much. I understand that our American colleague wanted to say a word.
It's okay.
It's okay. So thank you very much. Minutes of delay, so I guess we have 10-15 minutes for questions. See if you can introduce yourself.
Jean-Jacques de Saint-Andrieux, retired. We have heard a lot about economics and finance. What about democracy? Because mostly in the southern part of the world, democracy is very difficult to accept.
Well, if I may try first elements of answer, I think first that it would be wrong to say that the Global South would be mostly non-democratic and compared with others. In those many countries, you have countries which are democracies. I just take what happened in Liberia recently, the election in Liberia in Western Africa, which is really the incumbent, the outgoing president recognized his defeat, and it was still a country which went through terrible civil wars some decades ago. So there are really examples of democratic lives. And the second issue for me is to try to answer that democracy is not for me, a Western value. There can be different forms of democracy, but the possibility of the people to decide for themselves, it's for everybody. So I'm grateful that you raised this issue, because we have not, well, it was our Indian colleague mentioned it, I think, at one point, but we have to answer this. And again, it shows that it is much more complicated than we think, because in the Global South, you have big and also small countries which are really model democracies, and where we in the West, we could even learn from. Okay. But maybe other answers.
Can I just number one is I am extreme when it comes to the desire for democracy. So on that point, I'm with you completely. But just two remarks. First of all, the establishment of democracy in Ghana, in Nigeria, in South Africa is the issue of Ghanaians and Nigerians and South Africans. It's not somebody else's fight. We have to get it ourselves. And sometimes the problem is the global North looks down on the South as if, you know, bad boy, because you've done this, we're not going to do this anymore. So point number one is that's our fight. We need to do that, and we are doing it. My home country, Ghana, have had elections for, decades now. Number two, I'm really glad about what you said. Please encourage your leaders in the global North. Don't mess up with the democracies that we have. History has so many cases of our democracies being ended by countries in the global North. We all know that. The papers, these past 50 years now, Patrice Lumumba, you just name it, okay? So again, I'm with you. I want it to be very clear. I'm fighting for democracy in my home country. But it's our fight. And tell your leaders, once we have our democracy, leave us alone and let us continue it, and don't bring it to an end.
Other answers? Yes? For democracy?
Oh, I'll just be very quick. I just want to say that democracy is certainly a very noble idea, but I think we must also respect the geopolitical and political agency of countries and civilizations and nations to sort of evolve into the kind of democracies they want to, without sort of being told or forced from the outside, number one. Number two, the whole framing of democracies versus non-democracies is simply not going to cut in the years to come. When the Ukraine war broke out, a lot of Western leaders came to India and said, listen, you got to stand with the democracies. The Indians basically said, no, that's not how we see the world. That's not how we look at the international system. For us, Russia is also an important partner, and we don't sort of necessarily see international politics or geopolitics. In fact, nobody does. When national interest is on the line, a lot of countries tend to look at national interest and not democracy. And finally, let me give you an example. The reason we have an issue with China is not because China is undemocratic or it doesn't have a democracy internally. It is simply because China has exhibited aggressive intentions towards India. It's as simple as that. Is China a democracy or not a democracy? It doesn't bother us. What matters is something else.
But we should also, Chair, without being too provocative, raise the question whether India is a democracy itself, let alone the largest.
You want me to very quickly, sure.
No, you don't have to answer everything.
I wasn't asking you, I was asking the chair.
Let's hear the audience.
I was asking the chair.
No, well, if I may say something, we should listen to an African wisdom, which is it is for each country to build its own democracy. It's what our colleague said. I think you get the right answer, but it's it would be my answer. I don't want to speak neither for India nor for anybody else. Other questions?
Yes, we have one, Julia. Thank you all very much. Should I stand? Thank you all for your intervention.
Can you
tonight.
introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Julia Woods. I'm a PhD candidate here at NYU in history and Francophone study. I study 20th century Senegal during the Cold War. I wanted to ask a question about the particular dynamic of the African continent that was articulated by Professor Adebanjo. That the African continent goes into the 21st century without a particular emergent power like Brazil, like the United States, like China. So I'm curious, what is the potential of the African Union or other African trans-regional federations, such as ECOWAS, to harness power across the continent and make non-alignment movement not as a metaphor, but as practice?
We have two African colleagues.
I'll start. Getting an African Union, getting the Organization of African Unity is something which is very dear to the hearts of many Africans, okay? Almost all the intellectuals, if there's one thing they want, that's what it would be. Think about this. Let's imagine there's a continent and you really want to mess up that continent. You want that continent not to grow and to have problems. What would you do? You take this landmass and you draw little squares all over the place, right? And not only that, you'd say, you guys speak English, you guys speak French, you and you Portuguese, but we're going to put a French person in between and an English person there, right? That's the reality of Africa. You've got these little tiny places, all speaking different languages. My tribe, the Ashanti, is divided into two countries. I have relatives who live in Côte d'Ivoire and now speak French, and I have relatives, my immediate relatives in Ghana. Same tribe, same people, okay? And so that's the reality. Those are the cards we were dealt with at independence. And if there's one thing Africans want to do, they want to unite. So I mentioned the Organization of African Unity in the 60s. For one reason or the other, left-wingism, interference from the United States, because the Freedom of Information Act now means that the documents from the 60s are now out in the public sphere. We now know that the CIA intervened and brought down Kwame Nkrumah. It's all out there, okay? It's in the public domain now because the 50 years have passed, okay? So our democracy was arrested, was ended. I'm not saying Kwame Nkrumah is a good person, but it was ended. He was somebody who wanted to unite the entire continent and couldn't do it. So in answer to your question, we are trying desperately. Older generation, definitely. We're trying to do that. Younger generation, there's something called the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. So they're trying to use economics now rather than politics, which failed, and saying, let's get a common currency, let's get trade going back and forth, and let's try and do it that way.
Thank you very much for your question. Can I chair?
Yes, please.
Okay.
You are more than legitimate to answer the question.
Well, she asked me directly also.
Yes.
I think that what one must see are the sacrifices that some of these regional hegemons have made. And we do have regional hegemons, I would say. In Nigeria, carried the weight for the ECOWAS peacekeeping interventions for a decade in Liberia and Sierra Leone in the 1990s, and eventually helped stabilize those countries at the cost of 1,500 peacekeepers. Ghana, Guinea, lots of other countries were also alongside and made similar sacrifices. In Somalia, more recently, you've had Uganda and Ethiopia basically leading the AU's peacekeeping mission there since 2007. So 16 years of lonely peacekeeping. They've suffered 3,500 peacekeeping casualties. And when you consider that it took the death of 18 American soldiers in Somalia and 10 Belgians in Rwanda for them to basically collapse and kill those peacekeeping missions, then what the Africans are doing is actually very praiseworthy. But that doesn't get talked about enough. Instead, you get films made like Black Hawk Down that tries to present the Americans as the heroes. I think it's important, though, as far as Africa is concerned, to note that 16% of intra-African trade is not going to cut it, when Asia is at 50% and the European Union at 70%. So we need to have strong sub-regional pillars. Nigeria and South Africa account for 60% of West and Southern Africa's economy. If they don't have a vision for regional integration, then we're not really going to, we can declare whatever African continental trade that we want, but it's not really going to work unless that happens. And the tragedy of Africa, I think, is that many of our regional hegemons that should be leading, Nigeria, DRC, Ethiopia, many of them seem to be in internal conflicts themselves. So that's part of the problem. And the African Union, its institutions started out very well, led by Nigeria and South Africa, but they're quite weak. And apart from the Peace and Security Council, not many of them, NEPAD, APRM, ECOSOC, have really performed as was anticipated.
I have a small bit of the answer also on my side, because in the United Nations, we, as Europeans, as France, we have been working with the Africans to get to a more decisive UN support to peacekeeping missions by African troops under the African Union or other regional, sub-regional organizations supported by the UN, including financially. We think it is absolutely, this ownership is absolutely essential, because the Africans, as it was just said by my colleague, have done really also good jobs when they were able to do it. And we should more make it possible for Africans to do peacekeeping in Africa. But it needs to have the support of the United Nations system more. Maybe, have we still the possibility of having a last question?
Yes, that's what I was going to ask. Last question online.
So the question online is?
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yeah. Continue. We'll read the...
I'll read it out.
Oh, okay. Great.
Natural.
This is a question from Vicky Acevero. Thank you for this very rich and thoughtful discussion. Can a reformed global governance evolve within the context of the United Nations? Really, I want to hear the views of the panelists on the obsolescence of the nation state as an organizing principle.
Who dares answer the question, which is quite interesting. Yes, please.
No, I think, again, what we're trying to do in the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is exactly that. We've realized that the political boundaries are it's just too hard to get our nations to form a union. So let's forget about the politicians and let the people themselves find ways to do economic transactions across countries, okay? So that's the point. One of the things that I work on data a lot, and there is data, I think it was just quoted about the amount of trade between African countries. I've gone down to look at the data, and in my opinion, it's underestimated. Even during COVID, the trade between Ghana and Burkina Faso was intense. There's this trade where In Ghana, it's very moist. If you have maize that needs to be dried, it's hard to do it in the south because of the rains. So there's this massive exodus of maize, corn to Burkina to get dried and then return back to Ghana to get sold. All of this is not measured. It's amazing the intricacies of the trade in West Africa. So whoever asked that question, it's a great thing. We are actually trying to use economics to get rid of this, what did she say, he or she say, obsolete concept of the nation state. I applaud that.
Yes, please. Everybody, it will be the final word, so you can all speak if you want. Yes, but first we have Yusuke.
Yeah, I don't think the nation state would be obsolete because they are the ultimate guarantors of the safety of its citizens. I don't think there's going to be an entity that's going to protect, take on that function. Having said so, there are probably realms of global governance that would have a greater role for entities outside the nation state. For example, the digital realm. It's a realm where there are no global governance as of yet, and where there to be one, I don't think the nation state would have the technical capacity to think of regulations. It would need to take place in cooperation with enterprises.
Thank you. Very short answers, please, because we have to wrap up.
Sure.
Yes, Kenneth, please.
Okay, great. Very quickly, no, I agree. The nation state is not disappearing in a Hobbesian world, but the United Nations system has failed miserably time and time again, and I have very little hope for it. I mean, I think it's a debating society, and that is that, period. And I like the focus on economics and on the digital world as well as a means to connect people.
Thank you. Final word.
I think the nation state is here to stay, but I do think these institutions of global governance need to be reformed. The United Nations is the world of 75 years ago, 80 years ago. It's not the world of today. So in an ideal world, I really wonder, Ambassador, whether France and Britain should be permanent members of the Security Council. It does not reflect power dynamics today. I wonder why a European is always head of the IMF and an American head of the World Bank, as if by some kind of genetic genius. We need to reform these institutions.
We have plenty of them, you know.
To reflect the current world. And one of my recommendations is for Britain and France to leave the Security Council.
No, you say that because you are not even able to secure an agreement on who should be for Africa. Please.
You know, on that very interesting question about the obsolescence of nation states, I think it is important to realize that different regions are in different, let's say, places. There is a post-national zone in Europe, perhaps, a post-modern sort of state where, you know, people think that, you know, you can sort of give up on nationalist claims and move on to a different phase. In a different region, for example, in South Asia, we are still sort of in a state-building mode or state-making mode, as it were. The sovereignty is still sort of something that we think should be strengthened. The borders still need to be put in place before we can move on to the next level. So I think you know that is not going to happen anytime soon in most parts of the world. Point number one. Point number two. You know what happened to EU, for example. You had a Ukraine war, and suddenly all states are thinking about national security, thinking about solidifying their own borders. You know, they're looking very closely at immigration from certain other parts of the world, etc., etc. So it took a crisis for that post-national illusion to sort of collapse in some ways, at least. So I think we are in, as I completely agree with my colleague here, the nation state is going to stay for a very long time. All we can do is to sort of listen to the concerns of at least some of these, let's say, not so well-defined institutional forms like the Global South, so that they bring forth some of the collective concerns and voices from some of the disprivileged, underprivileged parts of the international system. Let's not get ahead of ourselves and sort of dismiss the nation state. Nation state is going to be there. We need to be concerned about, I think, more fundamental issues here of COVID vaccines, climate change funds, and whatnot. I think the important thing to do is to sort of look at the brass tacks as it were, not to sort of be in a hurry to dismiss the nation state. Thank you.
I don't want to have the final word, but I will also answer the question, of course. I think, as you said, there are new non-state actors, and the climate conventions have shown also the importance of non-state actors stepping in, including local governments, not only private actors, by the way. So this is new, and it is good, I think. But of course, the state nations, the nations, the states, national states remain the most important actors. And the regional organizations are important too. And the European Union is much more than a regional organization. The European Union is a good model for answering the question. And contrary to what was said, if I may again respectfully disagree, the European Union has been strengthened by its response to the recent crisis, including Ukraine, and we took common decisions, also COVID. So it is I think it remains something interesting to examine from other regions. And of course, we need to reform the governance of the Security Council of the United Nations. We have proposed, dear colleague, to enlarge it, but we are waiting for other continents to agree on what they want to do with this reform. Well, thank you for giving me this privilege of having the last word as a moderator. Thank you to all of you for coming in spite of the bad weather, Thanksgiving, which is coming up. Thank you to our panelists, especially those who came from very far away. I think our two colleagues from South Africa and from India, but also all the others. Some of them came from a bit less far away. And we have started, but there will be, as you know, as you have heard, at least 2 other sessions. So thank you very much, Guy Sorman, for organizing this and inventing this.
Next December.